Hi everyone, welcome to week 12. This week we'll be pulling together some threads discussed throughout the course, considering who is the teacher researcher, what is research, and what might research do to pedagogy. So this week is quite light on the readings to give you some time to begin preparing for your final assignments. So we'll be reading Rinaldi's article, Teacher as Researcher. By Saturday at 11:55 p.m., post a link to Portfolio Entry 10 and begin working on preparing for your final assignments. And by Sunday at 11:55 p.m., participate in your group's 1-hour virtual collaboratory. So thinking of ourselves as teachers and researchers requires us to situate ourselves in between the role of leading and following the child. And in doing this, we bring our histories, their tensions, our artistic passions and wonderings into moments of inquiry with others. So actively listening to children, materials, and place, and nourishing sustained attention to how we affect and are affected by others through our methodologies of research and pedagogy. So this is a sort of a state of lingering and listening, and this requires vulnerability and openness across difference, and as we've discussed previously, across layers of past, present, and future knowledges, and staying with the frictions and difficulties that these overlappings may provoke. And in attuning to the rhythms of these lived moments and enhancing their aesthetic qualities, perhaps we might provoke children's emerging theories about what something is and what something might become. So slowing down our pedagogical processes, we might create spaces to think deeply about our ethical obligations as educators in current times and how we might respond. And I think this is part of the role of the teacher researcher. So as educators, research is a vital process that stimulates and sustains our pedagogical trajectories and attentions with children. And then Mannon writes, pedagogy requires a phenomenological sensitivity to lived experience, children's realities and life worlds. Pedagogy requires a hermeneutic ability to make interpretive sense of the phenomena of the life world in order to see the pedagogic significance of situations and relations of living with children. And pedagogy requires a way with language in order to allow the research process of textual reflection to contribute to one's pedagogical thoughtfulness and tact. So at the beginning of this course, we asked the questions, what is research and how can research be imagined? How do we come to know and understand the world around us? So we've discussed the colonial histories of research, that this work is very much non-neutral and non-innocent, and that the word research in many ways carries with it violence. That research holds particular practices that over time often become so normalized that they become invisible and their meaning goes unnoticed. We've considered what becomes possible or impossible when research is conceived as a productive device in the service of a particular rationality, and what happens when educators become researchers. What happens when educators think artfully and pay attention to their practices, what they do, and how these practices might be rethought. So as teachers and researchers, there are particular dispositions and orientations to teaching and research that can be cultivated. So in asking what matters, what orientations are necessary, what skills or dispositions are necessary for the teacher researcher, we can think about what does research make possible and what are its effects? What and who is our research accountable to? How is it consequential? What kinds of relationships does it evoke? And what does it do to pedagogy? And I think these are key questions that will help you in your final paper. So considering how can research be an ongoing aspect of one's teaching practice? So Bell Hooks writes that engaged pedagogy does not simply empower students. Any classroom that employs a holistic model of learning will also be a place where teachers grow and are empowered by the process. So I wonder what changes you might have noticed throughout this course in yourselves as educators, not only in a professional sense, but possibly in your personhood. As educators, the educators here in Ecuador continue to discuss our processes as teachers and researchers. Something that's been coming up for us is imagining who is the teacher researcher and how do we think about ourselves within this role as both professional and personal. And that perhaps these professional and personal selves may be less distant from each other and less separate than we had previously assumed. So we've been thinking closely about how we bring ourselves into this work, our curiosities, our intimate thoughts about living and being, political orientations, tensions. And I think that something that sometimes happens in education is that there's a notion of professionality that distances ourselves, distances us from bringing our whole selves into this work, as if educators are apolitical and that this work is not personal. Yet, as we continue to pay attention to the structures in which we work, we continue to notice how these structures also work personally in our bodies and in our minds. So then my question is, what does this practice of research do to pedagogy, and what does it do to the role of the educator? And this is, I think, what I find hopeful and motivating about lived inquiry is that it brings educators into the thickness of lived moments with others. And it sort of aims, I think, to create a consciousness and an attention to respond. So in this week's article, Rinaldi writes about the pleasure of research. She writes, quote, "When we say that school is not a preparation for life, but is life, this means assuming the responsibility to create a context in which words such as creativity, change, innovation, error, doubt, and uncertainty, when used on a daily basis, can be truly developed and become real. This means creating a context in which the teaching-learning relationship is highly evolved. That is, where the solution to certain problems leads to the emergence of new questions and new expectations, new changes. This also means creating a context in which children from a very young age discover that there are problems which are not easily resolved, which perhaps cannot have an answer, and for this reason, they are the most powerful ones, because herein lies the spirit of research." So what might it mean to stay in the richness of a problem? To stay with that spirit, not to solve, but to think deeply and carefully with, to wonder and to consider what possibilities might emerge if we stay with the trouble of the problem, rather than quickly fixing or sort of falling into our humanist tendencies for an immediate solution. So these are excerpts from the Material Encounters book that speak to the possible orientations and dispositions of a teacher-researcher. So Pasini Ketchabal-Kind and Kocher write that we have tried to situate ourselves as researching with, not on or about children. Thus, our focus isn't about gaining knowledge. Rather, it is oriented as a collective search for insight and understanding so that we might more closely align ourselves with children's own experimentations, research pathways, and ways of being and knowing. Pedagogical documentation, then, is a particular kind of observing, noticing, and documenting. It's not an objective, distanced, standing back, or evaluative research. We are engaging in a constant search for other ways of seeing and attending, for perspectives that will enlarge our vision and allow for greater attunement. In an effort to see differently, we try to attend to an interplay of materials and the relationality between things. If our methods make the world in particular ways, and if the nature of the attention that we give to things shapes that which we are considering, then we need inventive practices to help us get to know things differently and in their complexity. The ways that we attend to things matter. So I think this section speaks to the positioning of the educator. I notice words such as between, research pathways, and collectivity. And I think that these words sort of speak to the location and the orientation of the teacher researcher as not leading or following, but in between that space, and how in between and situating yourselves in the middle might give us space to think about the ways in which we are attending to things. So as a teacher and researcher, what kind of knowledges do you care about? What counts? We've been staying with this quote by Donna Haraway throughout this course when she writes, "It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell other stories with. It matters what knots not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what worlds worlds." So if we think that our methods of thinking do not reflect, but rather create meaning, then what kinds of methods are required to create the worlds we want to live in? And I think this is a central concept to think with as we conceptualize what is the role of the teacher researcher. As educators, we're not delivering curriculum, we're actively creating subjects. We are implicated in the construction of meaning and its effects, and therefore this work requires not only teaching but also researching to actively investigate the methods and meaning we are constructing with others and the consequences of that meaning. What are we throwing into the world and what might it do? So for your portfolio entry 10, we're going to be focusing on the teacher as researcher, and this entry can be used as part of your final paper. So I encourage you to craft this in a way that you can incorporate it into your final paper. So the aim of this entry is to help you get started in this assignment. So reflect on what we have explored, read, and discussed throughout the term, and review the BC Early Learning Framework and the understanding of the BC Learning Framework from theory to practice documents, and create a one-page entry that describes the image of the teacher, or more specifically, write a passage that describes the teacher as researcher. So create this entry as if it were an entry in the BC Early Learning Framework. And imagine that you are writing an entry responding to similar questions that are proposed in page 1. So what is teacher research, and how does the framework see the teacher? So to write this entry, you should rely on readings, the course text, and course content. And your discussion needs to reflect your learning in this course. So make sure to write it in an accessible and direct language, and paraphrase authors' ideas whenever possible. And try to not use direct quotes except for occasional short phrases, so no longer than 4 words. Try to stay away from large block quotations, and as I've suggested in your living inquiry assignments, really try to focus on how you are situating the quote within your own writing, so introducing the quote, and bringing it into your own writing. So this entry can be used in your final paper. So your final papers are due on December 9th. You'll notice that the Dropbox for your final paper opens on December 2nd if you'd like to submit it early. So using the course textbook, researching